On the morning of February 28, 2026, the world woke up to news that almost no one believed was possible. The most powerful man in Iran, the man who had ruled that country for 36 years, who had outlasted 8 American presidents, who had survived wars, assassinations attempts, and sanctions, was dead. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader since 1989, was killed in a United States and Israeli attack on Iran, and within hours, the entire world changed. This is the story of how it happened, why it happened, and what it means for the rest of us. To understand what happened on February 28th, you have to understand who Ali Khamenei was. He was not just a president or a prime minister. He was not a man who could be voted out of office. As supreme leader, he held authority over the judiciary, state media, and all security forces, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known as the IRGC. He was the top religious and political authority in Iran. Every military decision, every nuclear negotiation, every crackdown on protesters, it all went through him. After taking power in 1989, Khamenei's main goal was to keep the Iranian government stable. To his supporters, he was a strong leader who kept the country together during difficult times and wars. But to his critics, he held too much power. Over the years, when people took to the streets to ask for changes, like in the major protests of 2022 and again in early 2026, Khamenei used the police and military to stop them. For many Iranians, his rule was a time of security. For others, it was a time of fear. Khamenei also changed how Iran dealt with the rest of the world. He built a network of allies in places like Lebanon, Gaza, and Yemen. He called this the axis of resistance. He believed that by supporting these groups, he was protecting Iran from being invaded by its enemies. However, the US and Israel saw this differently. They saw a leader who was starting conflicts and attacking their cities. This shadow war went on for decades, with both sides waiting for the other to blink. On February 28th, the waiting finally ended. The wave of airstrikes began after sunrise in Iran, with huge explosions ringing out in the capital Tehran. People across Iran woke up to the sound of fighter jets and missiles. Israel's defense ministry announced it had launched a preemptive strike on Iran as sirens sounded in Jerusalem, and people across the country received phone alerts about an extremely serious threat. This was not a targeted strike on one building. This was a massive, coordinated military campaign across the entire country. The strikes on Iran targeted 24 provinces. Iranian media reports say that over 200 people have died, with hundreds more injured. But the real toll could be much higher. Military installations, weapons factories, intelligence facilities, and leadership compounds were all hit at the same time. The scale of the operation was unlike anything the world had seen in the modern Middle East. How did they find him? That was the question everyone was asking. Khamenei was known to move between locations regularly. He had layers of security. He had spent decades hiding from exactly this kind of threat. An Israeli military official told reporters that the US and Israeli militaries spent months building up an extensive bank of targets in Iran and were looking for the right moment to strike when senior Iranian officials would meet. The official said 3 separate gatherings of senior officials were struck simultaneously Saturday morning. This was not a hasty decision. This was the result of months, possibly years, of intelligence work. Satellites, informants, electronic surveillance, and highly sophisticated tracking systems were all used to locate Khamenei and his inner circle at the same moment. President Trump, in a post on Truth Social, described how the intelligence operation worked. He wrote that Khamenei was unable to avoid our intelligence and highly sophisticated tracking systems, and working closely with Israel, there was not a thing he or the other leaders that have been killed along with him could do. Khamenei was killed by an Israeli strike, but it was a joint operation from the very start. The United States provided intelligence, military coordination, and logistical support. The military said the operation was conducted with full synchronization and coordination between the Israeli and U.S. forces. It was not only Khamenei who died that day. IRGC commander Mohammad Pakpour, Iran's defense minister Amir Nasirzadeh, advisor to Khamenei Ali Shamkhani, and chief of staff of the Iranian armed forces Mohammad Bagheri were killed in Israeli strikes in Tehran. In one morning, Iran lost its supreme leader and the entire top layer of its military and security command. Khamenei's daughter, son-in-law, and grandson were also killed. The attack was not surgical, it was total. But the destruction reached far beyond military compounds and government offices. In the southern city of Minab, a missile struck the Shajareh Tayyebeh girls' school during morning classes. While the target was reportedly a nearby IRGC naval base, the impact was felt by the families of over 160 children who never came home that day. For many, this changed the narrative of the entire operation, turning a high-level assassination into a national tragedy that has sparked outrage across the globe. Why did they do it now? In a video message, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explained that the goal was to finally remove what he called an existential threat. He named the mission Operation Roaring Lion and said it was time for the Iranian people to take their destiny into their own hands. Netanyahu pointed to nearly 50 years of conflict, saying the regime had spent decades calling for death to Israel and death to America, while hurting its own people. For the Israeli leader, this wasn't just a military strike. It was a move to change the future of the entire Middle East. President Trump called Khamenei one of the most evil people in history and said his killing was justice for Americans and others killed by Iran over the decades. Trump signaled that the U.S. and Israel were prepared for an open-ended campaign, stating that heavy and pinpoint bombing would continue until their strategic goals were met. His message was a direct call for regime change, urging the Iranian people to take back their country while the military pressure remained at its peak. The Iranian response was immediate and ferocious. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps pledged revenge and said it had launched attacks on 27 bases hosting U.S. troops in the Middle East, as well as Israeli military facilities. Iran struck back with a fresh wave of attacks across the region. It unleashed strikes on U.S. military bases, Israel, and targets across the Middle East, rocking densely populated areas and disrupting air travel and oil shipments. Blasts and air raid sirens were heard in Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. The Middle East had become a war zone in a single day. History does not pause to let us catch our breath. On the morning of February 28, 2026, one of the longest-running conflicts of the modern era reached a point of no return. A man who had ruled for 36 years was gone. Missiles were flying across the Gulf. The strikes raised concerns that retaliations could disrupt the oil trade, which is heavily dependent on the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway Iran controls, and which is already seeing disruption. The day that changed everything had arrived.